2023 is going to be an interesting year for wide receivers in fantasy football. On one hand, we have the ascending young talents like Chris Olave trying to push their way up the ranks. And on the other, we have the proven veterans like Davante Adams trying to hold off Father Time for one more season. And this creates some questions for fantasy managers. When should we pivot from proven production to some of the younger options? Which of the younger options is most likely to ascend the fantasy ranks in 2023? And finally, when should we consider taking a wide receiver over a running back and vice versa? Today, we are going to take all of the factors into consideration: age, talent, and team environment in order to tier and rank the top 15 wide receivers for fantasy football in 2023. That brings us to Tier 1, young alphas in great situations. These are guys that check all of the boxes. They can earn targets, they can score touchdowns, and they play with high-quality quarterbacks in pass-first offenses, and both are under the age of 25. And these two wide receivers are Justin Jefferson and Jamar Chase. I'm willing to take these two wide receivers at the top of almost any format, but especially when we're dealing with a half PPR or full PPR and you're required to start 3 wide receivers like we are on Underdog. Additionally, running backs are falling further than ever, making them a lock in your drafts to go ahead of CMC and Austin Eckler, and you can still come back and get a player like Ramondre Stevenson, Tony Pollard, or Josh Jacobs in round 2 or 3. That brings us to Tier 2, and we were talking about the aging alphas. Yeah, they're aging, getting a little older, but they're still alphas. These guys are earning targets at a very high rate, and they haven't shown us any signs of decline. Having said that, we know that the age cliff can hit at any time, and that puts them in a tier below Justin Jefferson and Jamar Chase. And the name at the top of this tier is Cooper Kupp. He goes in the first 5 picks on Underdog right now. He'll be a little over 30 years old when the season starts, but he had a 29% target share last season. And beyond that, he's the #1 point per game scorer in each of the last 2 years in fantasy. The one potential knock on Cooper Kupp is the fact that the Rams are only projected for 6.5 wins right now by odds makers. In fact, they are underdogs right now in 11 out of 17 games per Superbook. However, we saw what Cooper Kupp looked like in a bad offense last year. The Rams were 3-5 when he got injured, yet he was still churning out fantasy points. And furthermore, there's a chance that the Rams outperforms Vegas expectations. We get Matthew Stafford back, and Sean McVay is still one of the better play callers in the league, continually dialing up mismatches. 45% of Cooper Kupp's targets came with a linebacker or safety in primary coverage. That's just not fair. That brings us to Stefon Diggs, who's just shy of 30 years old. And wow, he still earns targets at a high rate, a little bit lower than Kupp and Tyreek Hill, 26%, but he's in an offense that wants to throw the ball all the time, and he has an elite quarterback in Josh Allen. While I have Diggs a little bit behind Kupp, they project very closely. I've got Cooper Kupp at 15.4 fantasy points per game and a half PPR, and I've got Diggs just behind him at 15.0. He is a smash pick in the middle of round 1. And that brings us to the last name in this tier, and that is Tyreek Hill of the Miami Dolphins. He will be a little over 29 years old when the season starts, and he has been phenomenal. He set a career high target share last year of 29%, and he had a mouth-watering 3.30 yards per route run. That was the #1 in the NFL. He was also the highest graded PFF wide receiver. And finally, 16.3 points per game last year. But guess what? It was even better when Tua was under center. It was at 17.3 in half PPR settings. And if it isn't enough that Tyreek Hill is just a great football player, he is an amazing fit in Mike McDaniel's scheme because play action passing. 43% of his targets came on play action. That is way above the average for other NFL wide receivers. He has a coach that's constantly getting him into space where he can use his speed to create angles and score long touchdowns. Up until a couple of days ago, Tyreek Hill was actually at the top of this tier. Now I have him at the bottom because we do have some concerns. Tua's concussions are certainly a risk to his fantasy value, but now we also have a report of alleged assault per Pro Football Talk. And even if charges aren't brought, there's a chance that the league wants to investigate Hill, and that brings the possibility of a suspension. Before the news broke on Hill, I was comfortable taking all of these wide receivers ahead of CMC and ahead of Travis Kelce in my half PPR and full PPR drafts, especially given the quality of running backs that we can get in round 3. And you guys know that I love Mark Andrews, but now I have just enough doubt with Tyreek Hill. I don't blame you guys if you want to drop him below CMC and Kelce, but I would continue to take Cooper Kupp and even Stefon Diggs ahead of those two. Now we turn our attention to tier 3, where we have high-end target earners that are still in their prime and Davante Adams. And at the very top of this tier, we have CeeDee Lamb coming in as my number 6 wide receiver, going to be just over 24 years old. And guess what? You could actually make an argument that he belongs in the top tier with Jamar Chase and Justin Jefferson because his target shares are similar. His air yard share of 34% is also in the same ballpark, and he's an ascending talent. He has a quality quarterback, and he plays on a team in Dallas expected to win 9.5 games. And furthermore, the target competition situation in Dallas looks favorable for Lamb. Yeah, they added Brandon Cooks, but he's never been an elite target earner. He's more of a 20 to 21% guy, and Dalton Schultz moved on to the Texans. Over on Underdog, CeeDee Lamb actually goes after A.J. Brown. I am ranking him above A.J. Brown because I still think there's a ceiling to get to a 30% target share, which will be much tougher for Brown thanks to Devonta Smith. Speaking of A.J. Brown, he is my number 7 wide receiver. He will be just a little bit over 26 years old when the season starts, and despite the fact that he has to deal with that high-end target earner in Devonta Smith, he was still really good in his own right last year with a 26% target share. And wow, is he able to create big plays, especially off of play action. Yards after the catch, 6.4. That's one of the best in the top 15 wide receivers. And it's the Eagles, guys. We know they're going to score a lot of points. So while the target share thing could be a little bit of a problem for A.J. Brown, he's still got the potential to score gobs of fantasy points, making him a value at the end of round 1 in your drafts. That brings us to one of my personal favorites as my number 8 wide receiver, and that is Amon-Ra St. Brown, the Sun God. Last season, he scored 13.4 points per game in a half PPR setting, but guess what? In the games where he was actually healthy, it didn't have to depart due to injury, he scored 15 points per game. That's just barely behind A.J. Brown. If you're looking for a potential younger version of Cooper Kupp, Amon-Ra St. Brown is your dude. He plays in an offense where they constantly keep him in motion. They put him inside in the slot. He gets all of those same sort of looks against linebackers and safeties, and he's got the ability to create big plays after the catch. And guess what? The Lions are scheduled for the 3rd most shootouts according to Superbook odds makers. Right now, Amon-Ra St. Brown is going after Garrett Wilson on Underdog. Now look, I love Garrett Wilson, but I think it's a bit of a stretch to be taking him over a player that's got proven 15 point per game upside like Amon-Ra. And that brings us to our final player in this tier, my wide receiver 9. It is Davante Adams. I recently moved Adams down the ranks just because we've got questions. He will be 30.7 years old. That's a tad older than the guys we talked about in tier 2. And we have the questions around Jimmy Garoppolo. The Raiders reworked the contract. They can walk away from Jimmy G for nothing if he can't pass a physical, and he's yet to practice. Now, the Raiders are playing it cool. They're acting like this is all expected. They knew this was going to happen, and they do say that Jimmy G will be ready for training camp. But you have to wonder, why did they rework the contract? So with those questions, that's enough to move him to the bottom of this tier. Now, On the positive side, you're talking about a guy that can still earn targets with the very best wide receivers in the league, and he also has an ability to score those touchdowns. And even if you were forced to see Brian Hoyer in action for a few games, it might not be optimal, but Adams is one of the few players that's shown us, regardless of who's under center, he can still score fantasy points. So all of the wide receivers in tier 3 are in play at the end of round 1 and at the beginning of round 2. You can even start with 2 wide receivers. One note of caution though, those running backs, those sweet values in round 3, they don't always make it back to that draft position. So if you start with 2 wide receivers, be willing to take 2 more and be comfortable with what you're going to do at running back later in the draft. And now we turn our attention to tier 4, which is our next generation of potential stud wide receivers for fantasy football. And we start with Garrett Wilson. Wilson was a top 24 point per game player as a rookie. He had an 85.9 PFF receiving grade. That's the 5th highest mark we've seen since 2011. Do you want to know the other names in that list? Odell Beckham Jr., Justin Jefferson, Terry McLaurin, and Michael Thomas, followed by Garrett Wilson. That is a really good list to be on. Additionally, Aaron Rodgers is a massive upgrade over Zach Wilson. Only 66% of Garrett Wilson's targets were deemed catchable from Zach Wilson last season. That's 10 percentage points below any other wide receiver in the same average depth of target range. Yeah, 2022 was not a great year for Aaron Rodgers. However, we don't have to turn back time very far to see him playing at a near elite level in 2020 and 2021 when he was making a push for MVP consideration. Right now, Wilson has actually leapt over Davante Adams over on Underdog. That feels like a tad too much for me. However, I get the excitement, and I think he's very valuable as an early second-round pick. And plus, where he goes in the draft, he's very easy to stack with Aaron Rodgers in the later rounds. Now let's take a look at my number 11 wide receiver, and that is Jalen Waddle of the Miami Dolphins. He's an early to mid-second-round pick right now, and his target share came down a little bit last year. The arrival of Tyreek Hill did steal some looks, but guess what? Mike McDaniel truly opened up this offense through a lot of play action, motion, mismatches against linebackers and safeties. We saw the yards after catch jump from 4.4 to 7.0, and we saw the average depth of target jump from 7 yards to 12.2, which allowed Waddle to score more on the efficiency front. In fact, only Jamar Chase delivered more 15-plus yard receptions on his targets. Waddle was at 44% versus Chase at 47%. And furthermore, if for some reason Tyreek Hill is to miss time, if he does get suspended, Waddle's going to have top 6 wide receiver upside. Remember, as a rookie, he already showed that he could earn more targets than what he did last year. And with the improvements to the offense via Mike McDaniel, the upside is huge. We're not done with the young stud wide receivers yet. Now we look at number 12, Chris Olave of the Saints. He goes in the middle of round 2. And wow, is there a lot to like. Only 2 wide receivers last year reached at least a 25% target share and accounted for 40% plus of their team's air yards. It was Chris Olave and Davante Adams. Olave's rookie season comps read like a who's list since 2011. We've got Justin Jefferson, A.J. Brown, Jamar Chase, and Odell Beckham Jr. Chris Olave is an absolute stud. Now, some people are concerned. Michael Thomas is going to be back, supposedly going to be healthy. But last year, get this, when those 2 players were on the field together, Chris Olave out-targeted Michael Thomas 29% to 21%. And add in the final factor that we get Derek Carr. Now look, I'm not a huge Derek Carr supporter, but he is an upgrade over what we saw last year with Andy Dalton, and it should open up the playbook to throw the ball a little bit more in New Orleans. Chris Olave is a fun pick in the middle of round 2 or late round 2. And speaking of wide receivers that can earn targets no matter who else is on the field, let's look at my wide receiver 13, and that is Devonta Smith. Last year, despite playing with an absolute beast in A.J. Brown, he still demanded a 25% target share. While I like Smith in this range of the draft, the real question is, do you want to take him over one of the elite running backs? Because things basically went as well as we could hope for last year. While it was great to see him be able to earn that 25% target share, the question we have to ask is if there is upside from there. And most likely, battling with A.J. Brown, we could see a little bit of a decrease in his target share. Now, there are ways you can offset that when you play in a great offense like the Eagles. It could come through touchdown variants, big plays. There are ways Devonta Smith still gets there. You just have to ask yourself if you're willing to take him over a player like Tony Pollard or Ramondre Stevenson. And that brings us to our final tier 4 wide receiver, and that is T. Higgins, who comes in at number 14. So here's the thing with Higgins. Technically, his talent earning profile and air yards earning profile, they're questionable. They don't stack up with some of these other names in the tier, but we have to acknowledge the fact that he does play with Jamar Chase, who's an absolute alpha. So there's a chance that really he still is that wide receiver 2 level player, but because of the level of competition, it's holding him down a little bit. And we have seen spike games from Higgins whenever we've had Jamar Chase out. But here's the kicker with Higgins. He plays on the Bengals. It's a pass-first offense with an elite quarterback in Joe Burrow. So even if he really is more like a wide receiver 3 profile, those two factors can drag him up into the wide receiver 2 conversation, which makes him a worthy pick at the end of round 2 or at the beginning of round 3. All of the options in tier 2 are viable players that you can select in round 2 or round 3 of your fantasy drafts. The big question is if you're willing to take one of these wide receivers over a running back in round 2 like Nick Chubb, Saquon Barkley, Jonathan Taylor, Tony Pollard. Technically speaking, the ceiling for those players looks better than the wide receivers we're talking about. However, supply and demand, especially on Underdog, dictates that you've got to get after the wide receivers early, and there's a chance if you don't take one in round 2, there's not going to be a name you really love in round 3, whereas the running backs are falling into round 3. You could still get Ramondre Stevenson, Josh Jacobs, or Derrick Henry. So just remember, if you really want to make sure you're getting one of each position in rounds 2 and 3, I would start with the wide receiver and come back with the running back in round 3. So that brings us to tier 5, which is an important point in your drafts because it is a significant tier break. There are a lot of guys we could talk about here, and if you want to see all of them, you can go over to fantasylife.com and you can check out my tiers and you can read all about it. But today I really want to focus on DK Metcalf. So we talked about the tier drop from the other wide receivers to Metcalf, and that's not even really the whole story. The other big component of this is opportunity cost. Where Metcalf goes paired with that tier break makes him a tough selection for me because I could take Mark Andrews. I actually have Andrews projected for more fantasy points in PPR and half PPR settings, and he plays at a position where I can better differentiate against my league mates. If Mark Andrews is gone, there's still a chance that one of the other running backs slid down to you, like Josh Jacobs, Derrick Henry. If that's not the case, you could turn your attention to a league-winning quarterback. We see Josh Allen make it to the middle of the 3rd round, and if not, you could also look at Lamar Jackson, who's almost always there. And those are just assets that make it very hard for me to click on DK Metcalf.